To get the most out of a hypervisor like Proxmox, you'll want to connect it to shared storage. Even if it's just a standalone computer, you get the benefit of being able to back up all of your files from one central location. But the real benefit is when you've got a cluster of servers, because if you give these servers access to the same shared storage, it means that if you want to do a live migration of a virtual machine from one hypervisor to another, it'll go a lot more quicker because the actual files themselves never move. Similarly, if an actual hypervisor breaks, another hypervisor can then restart the actual virtual machines that had stopped because it's got access to those files because they're on this shared storage. So how do you actually configure shared storage on Proxmox using NFS, for instance? Well, if that's something you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, because that's what we'll be going over. Now, what you use to provide your shared storage really depends on what you've got. So you could have a NAS, for example, a Linux computer, even a Windows computer is capable of providing an NFS share. Now, in my case, I'm going to be using TrueNAS, so the configuration might be somewhat different, but it's mostly the same because the idea is we want to set up an NFS share that Proxmox can get access to. The only thing is that Proxmox is going to try and connect in as the root user, and we don't want that. It's not a good security practice. But what we can do is we can actually restrict what Proxmox can get access to by effectively substituting that root account for a user account that we're going to create. So that's the first thing we need to do, is to actually create a completely new user account for Proxmox. So we're going to click on Accounts and then Users. Then we'll click the Add button. Now what you want to call this is up to you. So I'm just going to call this one PV User, because this is the Proxmox virtual environment. Click on username and it automatically gets populated. And then I'm going to give it a password. Now, as ever, I do suggest using something a lot more stronger and a lot more complicated than this. In the case of TrueNAS, I have to give this user account a primary group. It's just to do with the file permissions. When a file gets created or edited, the file has permissions for the user as well as the primary group of that user. So I can't deselect that option and not then give it a different group. In this case, I've got to do something. I mean, I can either create a completely new group or assign it to an existing group, but I'm going to keep things simple. The group really doesn't matter to me. It's just a matter of I need to give it access to a folder. All I'm interested really in is the user account itself. So I'm just going to leave this on the default setting here, where it's going to create a completely new primary group. Now, lower down, what we've got here when it comes to TrueNAS is that it's going to ask for what home directory do you want to give this user. Now, this is more of a service account. It's not a user account. They don't need to store anything in a home directory. So I don't need to change this setting, which is don't create a home directory in the first place for them. Other features, I'm just going to leave as is, but I do want to deselect that option, which is the Samba authentication. It's not really relevant. They're logging in to TrueNAS over an NFS share, so they don't need Samba authentication at all, so I may as well deselect that option. And then other than that, I'm just going to click on Submit, and then that'll create a new user account specifically that we can use for Proxmox, as well as the group. Although, as I say, the group itself doesn't really matter to me. It only really matters as far as the actual file permissions are concerned. Now, I like to keep my data separate, and I want to be able to restrict who's going to be able to actually get access to the data that these Proxmox hypervisors are uploading to the NAS. So for that reason, I need a dedicated NFS share, and I need to bind that to a specific folder on the NAS. Now, how you do that on your system really depends. Maybe you just need to create a folder to begin with. Now, I could do something, with TrueNAS here, but what I'm going to do is just create what's called a dataset instead, because it has some extra features, as I'll demonstrate. So I'm going to click on Storage, then I'm going to click on Pools. Now, I've only got one pool, so I'm just going to highlight that, and then over at the end, I'm going to select the ellipsis here, then click Add Dataset. And I need to give this a name, so I'm just going to call this one PVE VMs, because this is where I'm going to be storing the virtual machines for the Proxmox virtual environment. Now, there's a lot of options that you've got that you can change. So the idea is there's a lot of various options that get set for the pool itself. When you create a data set, as you can see, they inherit these options, but you can actually change them for each individual data set or folder, if you will. So for instance, here we've got an encryption option. Now, encryption takes a performance hit. There's no point encrypting data and wasting compute power if the data is publicly accessible in the first place, or there's nothing specifically private about that information anyway. So for example, computers, virtual machines, they don't actually have any data, or at least they shouldn't have any sensitive data on them. So for me, I'd rather have the performance over the encryption. The data is going to get stored somewhere else. That could be put into a folder that gets encrypted, but the virtual machines, I'm just going to leave them as unencrypted. So I've got the option to change this if I wanted to, but like I say, in this particular case, I'm just going to leave it on the default, which is no encryption. And when I say the default, that just happens to be because I set the pool itself up with a default setting of no encryption. So something to bear in mind, if the pool itself has been encrypted, every data set you create will be encrypted by default. So these are just my default settings. We've got a similar option up here for the compression level. So it's inheriting this default option of LZ4 as the encryption algorithm. I mean, I can change that to something else if I want. I can even disable it. Now, I haven't found a particular problem with virtual machines when it comes to compression, so I'm quite happy to leave that there. But if this had been a folder where I was storing files that had already been highly compressed, there's no point trying to compress them again. It could actually end up, using up more storage space, aside from, using up more compute power, having to do that compression in the first place. So again, it's a useful feature to have. In this case, I don't actually necessarily need it, to be honest. Now, there is one interesting feature for NFS in particular, and that's the sync option up here. The way I've got it set up is it's still on the default setting. So the idea is that in NFS, a computer sends data to the NAS, but it then sits and waits for a response back before it sends any more. So that gives you data integrity, but it comes at a cost of performance. Now, what you do about that is entirely up to you. There's different ways of handling this, for example. It depends on which is more important, the performance or the data integrity, because essentially with this set the way it is, what's going to happen is Proxmox will send data to the actual NAS. The NAS will then write it to disk. Proxmox is going to wait until that data has been written to the disk, which is going to be probably slower. Then the NAS is going to send back a response to say, yes, the data's been synced, send me more data. So as I say, that takes a bit of a performance hit. The thing to bear in mind is that if you do disable this feature, what can then happen is that if the NAS were to fall over, for example, say you have a power outage, say that enough disks were to break or something happened where the data wasn't actually committed to disk, you would lose the data. Basically, you could end up corrupting, in this case, virtual machines in the process. So that's something to bear in mind, is what you've got to weigh up, which is better to you, the performance or the actual the data integrity, essentially. Now, the actual virtual machines I'm running, they don't necessarily need particularly high throughput, so I'm quite happy to leave it as is. But I could change it if I wanted to. The options there. That's the key point. These are all options that I can choose. But what I can do is to improve this more, is to actually give the system an actual caching option. So what will then happen is TrueNAS will actually write the data off to a cache ready to be committed to the actual drives, but it'll be able to send a response back to the server quicker. So there are ways around this if you want to improve the performance. But like I say, I'm not going to actually change anything. I just want to demonstrate the difference over data sets. If I was just going to create a normal folder, I would have had to drop into the command line to do that. So this is actually even easier just to do it this way, to be honest. All I would have to do is just give it a name. I don't need to change anything, click on submit, and that's it. So that's all I'm going to do. Just click submit. And then off that goes, and it actually creates a completely new data set that I can now use to then share out using NFS. Now, the next thing that I need to do is to change the file permissions. Now, whether you need to do that really depends on the system you're using, so do check. Because for a Windows computer, for example, what you might find is that at a file level, everybody's got access anyway. In the case of TrueNAS, it's very restrictive, and it won't matter what permissions I allow in the actual NFS share. If these aren't allowing access for Proxmox, then it doesn't matter. So I do need to change these file permissions. So I'm going to click on the ellipsis for this specific data set. Then I'm going to select Edit Permissions. Now, because root is the user I'm logged in as, then as far as permissions go, root is the owner, Their primary group is wheel, so wheel is the group. And then for the access permissions, root, i.e. the user over here, has got full access. The group wheel has got read and execute access. Everybody else has got read and execute access. So as I say, straight away Proxmox would have a problem if it tried to upload any files to this. So we need to change these. So I could stick to the existing access mode, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to opt for this ACL manager within TrueNAS because it'll give me a lot more flexibility. Now, to be honest, I won't take full advantage of it, but it is there. And because it's a new folder, I may as well make this decision now because it's easier to do it now while there is no data there. So I'm going to click on Use ACL Manager, and it changes the mode over. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with one of the preset ACLs, which is restricted. I'll click Continue. So we've got 2 access list entries, but you can add more. So you can add groups in, you could add specific individual users. It's very, very flexible here. Now, what we've got to begin with is one for the owner, in other words, whoever we define over here, and then one for the group that we define over here. But again, we could change these if we wanted to. I mean, you can be very specific with a certain user or a certain group. Where you've got that ampersand at the end or @ sign, it's referring to these fields over here. So the owner @ means this user, group @ means this group here. You can also change the permission type from basic to advanced, for example. That allows you to get very, very granular in terms of what permissions are available. But I'm just going to stick with these sort of settings. These are fine for me. The idea is this is going to give me flexibility later down the line if I wanted to use them. And I'd rather do this now rather than later on. Now, I don't want root being the actual owner of this folder, so I need to change this to the actual user that we created earlier. So that's the PVE user. And I need to tick that box Apply User because there is a button down here to save the changes, but unless you tick the box, this doesn't apply. The reason being is that it can have significant impact if you change permissions in a folder. All of a sudden you might lock people out. So it's a case of this is an extra step just to make sure you do actually want to make the change. And it's the same for the group as well. I didn't create a special group at all for this. I've just got a group that's the same name as the user. I don't need a group that's got multiple users in it, so I was quite happy for it to create its own group. But again, I've got to tick that box to say apply the group. So I do want these changes applied to the actual folder. So those are our permissions, if you will. This is going to be our new owner and the group for this folder. I've got an option down here to apply the permissions recursively, and what that means is that if there's any folders within this parent folder, any subfolders, any files, it'll literally go through them and it'll actually change the permissions for them. But this is a completely new folder, so it doesn't really apply to me. There's nothing in there at all, so I don't need to do that. But if this was an existing folder that had data, yeah, you would really want to tick that box. So these are the changes we're going to make. I'm going to click on Save. So I've swapped over to the ACL mode from the access mode, and we've also changed who basically owns and has permissions to get access and make changes and so on to this data set. If I click on the ellipsis and go back to Edit Permissions, as you can see, that's all taken effect. We've now got a new user or owner and a new group as well. So that takes care of my file permissions. Now the next thing to do is to share the folder out using NFS. So here on TrueNAS, what I'm going to do is select Sharing. Then I'm going to select Unix Shares NFS. Then I'm going to click Add to create a new share. And then I need to select the actual folder that we want to share out. Now, when it comes to these general options, I mean, I could put a description in. I could also set up this option, which is all DIRs. Now, I don't need that because the hypervisors are just going to connect to this share and get access to everything through that share. This is more of a case of maybe you've got subfolders and you want to be able to give people direct access to the actual subfolders so that they don't have to navigate through, the top share, if you will, and then work their way through it. You can actually select this option to make things a bit easier, but it's not really relevant for the hypervisor we're setting up. Next option is Quiet. Now I'm going to select that, and that's to suppress certain syslog messages. Now, if I run into problems, I'll come back and deselect this, but otherwise I like to select that option. Down here, we've got enabled. Now, if we want to actually share this data out, then obviously we have to enable NFS sharing. So I do have to have that left out on its default setting of enabled. Then down here, we're going to click on advanced options. Now, because I'm setting this up for virtual machines, I certainly don't want it as read only, but I do need to make some changes here regarding mapping user accounts. The reason for that is Proxmox is going to be connecting in as the root user. Now, one thing that's going to cause a problem is the fact that my Proxmox servers and TrueNAS are using a different password for the actual root account, in which case it wouldn't work, the authentication will fail. But it's also a bad security practice anyway. So in that case, what I can do in TrueNAS is I can remap the root user account. I can't actually change that behavior within Proxmox itself. It's not giving me an option to say use this user account to log in. It's just going to use the root account whether I like it or not. But what I can do is I can remap the root account to something else. And that's why we created this other user account in the first place. So I'm going to put in this other user account that I created earlier. So that essentially what will happen is when Proxmox connects in as the root, TrueNAS is then going to remap that root account essentially as part of the connection and only give it access to wherever this user account and group can go to. Basically at this stage, it's only going to have access to that folder. So that gives me a bit of a better security practice, if you will, except for the fact it means that anybody who connects in as root, doesn't matter what password they supply, will get remapped to this account and get access. So that's something to bear in mind. So for that reason, you have to think about some additional security measures. Now, one option is to put a firewall in front of the NAS so that if you want to get access to the NAS, you've got to go through a firewall and only certain computers will then get access to it. But that takes a bit of a performance hit. So what I do is set up a dedicated network specifically for the storage. So this NAS has got an interface in a dedicated network, and so the hypervisors. So they'll get direct access, but nothing else will. But having said that, I still like to add in an extra line in here so that I at least restrict things to a specific IP range. I mean, I could do it for specific hosts if I wanted to. I might add more Proxmox servers, for instance, as we go along. So for me, I'm just going to leave it at the actual network. So anything in that direct network essentially is going to be able to get access to this. And if they use the root account, they'll be able to get access because then it'll get remapped to this user. But at least even still, I'll be limiting the access to that specific folder that we've got, because at the moment, that's the only thing that this user account and group have got access to. I mean, there is this other option, this map all user and map all group, but that's more for like anonymous connections. If you use that option, it doesn't really matter what account you use, you're going to get remapped to something else. Here we know it's going to connect in as root, so we may as well just be a bit more specific, but the principle is the same. The only thing to bear in mind is that you can't have both of these options enabled at the same time. You either remap the root account or you remap everything. So the only other option that I've got really here is this security option, which I'm not going to use. We're not using any authentication. I'm not going to get into the realms of Kerberos and so on, so I'm just going to leave that as is. In which case, we've now got our share ready to go. So I'm going to click on the submit button. Then that creates a new NFS share. Now the whole point about this video really has been about how do I actually configure Proxmox to get access to shared storage using NFS. Now, if you already know about NFS and have just jumped straight to this part of the video, it's going to be extremely short because there's very little you actually need to do. Now, as a prerequisite, you do need to make sure that the actual server or servers, if you've got a cluster, have actually got access to the NAS. So if I go to mine, so there's only one, I haven't actually set a cluster up yet, but if I go to this server here and go down to network, I do have an interface which is in that subnet. So it does actually have access to the NAS. I already know that in advance. So do make sure that's already configured in advance. But then if we go back to data center, and then we select storage, because we need to actually create new storage for our actual Proxmox system. Up here we've got a drop-down menu which says add, so I'm going to click on that drop-down menu. Then I'm going to select NFS. I then need to give it an ID, so it's not like the VMs where it has to be a number. I can call this something that's going to be meaningful to me. So I'm going to call this NFS-VMs. The idea being that I'm going to be setting this up for virtual machines. So when I create a virtual machine and it gives me the option of storage to choose, this is going to stand out as being an NFS share basically. Next thing I need to do is to tell it the actual server that I need it to connect to. So I'm going to use the IP address. The reason for that is you can run into a problem if you've got a cluster or just a standalone server and you're booting things up from cold. In other words, all of the hypervisors are turned off. If you're actually connecting to shared storage and all of your virtual machines are on shared storage and one of those virtual machines is your DNS server, hopefully you can see the paradox here. When these computers boot up, they're going to try and connect to the NFS share, a NAS, a SAN, whatever it happens to be, and they're going to try and do a DNS resolution. But the DNS server's not running yet, so they can't do it. So when it comes to hypervisors and various other infrastructure devices, it's much better to use the IP address so you avoid that potential problem with DNS not working. So now that we're given it the IP address of the server, we actually need to pick the share, and that's what it's referencing as the export. It's the share being exported by the server. Click the drop-down menu, and it's telling me what's available. So I'm going to pick that one there, which is the share that we just set up. Down here, we've got the content. So this is where we're going to restrict what Proxmox can actually store on this storage. Now, by default, it's set to disk image. We can change that to various options that we've got here. So when I click the drop-down menu, we've got a big list here. The good thing is you don't have to use a control key or a shift key to do multiple selection. Just click something, deselect something, and it'll either appear on the list or disappear from the list. So, for example, in this case, I'm going to be using this for virtual machines. And I think I'll try it for containers as well. I'll keep it all centralized. So by default, it's set to disk image. So I'm also going to click on container. You can see that suddenly popped up. But let's say I change my mind. If I click container again, it disappears. So as I said, it's very easy to pick things. So in this case, as I said, I'm just going to keep this one specifically for disk images and containers. I've already got a separate NFS share that I'll set up later for my ISO images to keep them centralized. But I'm going to click on container here and then click away, and that sets my content. For the nodes, at the moment, I've only got one node, but what you can do is if you've got a cluster, you can actually click on that drop-down menu and you can select it so that only certain nodes within the cluster are actually going to have access to this storage. It doesn't apply in my case, but it's there if you need to use it. Then we've got the enable option, which obviously enables the actual storage. So we do want to leave that as is, ticked. Down here, we've got an option for pre-allocation, but that's only visible because advanced is ticked. So I'm going to just deselect. So unless you've picked advanced at some point, while you've been configuring Proxmox, you won't see that. So do tick on the advanced option if you want to make some changes. Pre-allocation, it's similar to what VMware uses in terms of thick provisioning and thin provisioning. And it's all about saving storage space, basically. Let's say you've got a virtual machine that you're going to be creating and it's going to have a 40 gig hard drive. You've got choices here where you can either pre-allocate all of that disk storage in advance. In other words, if it's going to be a 40 gig file, you can actually have it create a file of 40 gig. So that's good for performance reasons, but it wastes disk space if you're not going to use it. Now, in a production environment, you should actually have enough storage space in the first place. It's not good to use thin provisioning. It's better to actually make sure you've got all that actual space in advance, otherwise you run into problems, but it's also for performance reasons, it's better. Now, interestingly enough, I was looking at some tests that somebody's run. This option here, which is default, what it does, it actually selects this option here, which is metadata. It only allocates enough space for the metadata. Full would have allocated the entire space that you asked it to use. But the performance trade-off isn't that bad, actually. They're actually very, very close in terms of the performance capabilities. So I'm going to leave that set as the default. The only thing to bear in mind, this is similar with VMware, for example, is that if you're using a SAN, for instance, that can do thick and thin provisioning itself, you don't want to be using that system on both your hypervisor and your actual SAN. In this case, for example, we'd either want to be doing full provisioning on the actual SAN and then leaving this one to do default provisioning, or would we want to be doing some sort of thin provisioning on the SAN, and this one then would then be full. If you mix the two up and they're both trying to only allocate enough, it can cause performance problems, so something to bear in mind. But in this case, I'm just going to leave it as the default because that seems fine. We then got an option over here, which is for the actual version of NFS to use. So you've got version 3 plus various version 4s here. Now, I'm already setting that on the NAS anyway. I've already blocked out version 3, so I don't mind. You do have to make sure that the two are in sync, and it's easy to just limit that on the actual NAS itself, and then just leave this at the default if you want, but entirely up to you. In either case, you can't sort of set this one to be version 3, for example, if the NAS itself doesn't allow version 3, like mine doesn't. So I'm just going to leave that at the default as well. I'm then going to click Add. So what it's then done is it's creating the storage, and you just saw a brief flicker there where the question mark popped up, but it's now actually connected. So it's actually connected into the NAS, and what it means now going forward is that if I want to create virtual machines, or in this case containers, I don't necessarily have to store them on the local storage now. I can take advantage of this NFS share, and it means that when I build a cluster and start adding servers in, I'll be able to store my actual virtual machines on this shared storage, and I'll get a lot better usage out of my hypervisors than if I was storing my virtual machine files on the actual local storage. Well, thanks for making it to the end of this video. I really do hope you found it useful. If so, then do click the like button and share, as that'll help get the video out to more people who might find it useful as well. If you've got any comments or suggestions, please post those in the comments section below. And if you're new to the channel and you'd like to see more content like this, then yes, do subscribe. Just remember to set the bell icon to actually send you notifications when new content gets released, although I also post to Twitter as well as Facebook. If you'd like to help the channel and support it, you can actually make contributions through PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. I've also got links to Patreon, and there's also the join membership option for YouTube itself. Patreon and YouTube members do have the option to actually benefit from early access as well. But above all, many thanks for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one.